Hi there, and welcome back to Ask Dr. Syra, our video series where I answer your questions about psychology, relationships, personal development, and spirituality. So today's question comes from Jacqueline, and the question is, Dear Dr. Syra, can you explain the difference between PTSD and complex PTSD? Okay, it's a short question with a very long and involved answer. So, first, let's talk about what is PTSD. PTSD, you might have heard this acronym before. It means post-traumatic stress disorder. It happens when somebody has had exposure to a really intense, difficult, horrifying event. Trauma happens when you believe your life or the life of someone you care about is in danger. And you don't have to physically experience it yourself. So I can have PTSD by watching something that's happening to someone else. So I don't necessarily have to be the recipient of the violence or the whatever. I can even just be observing it and feel fear. So that's trauma. Now, PTSD, so trauma is something that happens. PTSD is actually a diagnosed condition, and there's certain symptoms in that condition. So some of the symptoms are that the person will relive the event through flashbacks, through nightmares. They might avoid certain situations that remind them of that event. There might be some changes in their beliefs about what they think of other people, what they think of themselves. The most kind of common one that we think of is that hyper arousal. So when you're kind of jumpy and things, you get activated easier. And then there might be some somatic symptoms in the body. So that's kind of the overview of what PTSD looks like. And again, post-traumatic stress disorder happens because of an event that happened to you or someone you know and you witnessed, where you were afraid for your own life, or the life of someone else, that things were really, really dangerous. And most of us can we have these natural psychological mechanisms that help us move through trauma, but some of us get kind of stuck there, and there's a variety of reasons for that, and so that just stays. Now, complex PTSD, it's a newer kind of term. It's not yet in the DSM-5. So the DSM-5 is this book that mental health professionals, particularly psychologists and psychiatrists, these are the people who can assess. They have this book, and they kind of go to it to look at, okay, if you have 5 out of 8 of these symptoms, then we can give you this diagnosis. It's quite an art. Assessment diagnosis is quite an art, and not everybody can do it, and not everybody's qualified to do it. So you do have to work with a psychologist or a psychiatrist to get a diagnosis of PTSD. Now, complex PTSD is not yet in that book, right? And we're advocating for it as mental health professionals, because we do see differences between complex PTSD and how the recovery from those two things happens, and the kinds of interventions that we need to use. So with complex PTSD, the symptoms are pretty much the same. The difference between the two is that PTSD happens because you've witnessed or you've had this difficult, traumatic event, and it's gotten stuck with you one time. It's a single event, or a single group of events because you were at war or a certain context. Now, complex PTSD is a series of events that keeps happening over and over and over, and there's no respite. There's no break from the traumas. It's like one after another, after another, after another. And what we're finding it's not yet proven, but one of the suspicions that many mental health professionals have is we're seeing a link between complex PTSD and that interpersonal violence. So complex PTSD often occurs for people who have had physical abuse in their homes growing up. Sexual abuse, physical abuse, and the abuser was supposed to be a caregiver, right? It's supposed to be someone who protects you. It's supposed to be somebody who looks after you. And that person is the person who hurts you. And when that happens, something really kind of shifts inside of us, because we're not designed for that. We're designed to trust our caregivers, right? To listen to our caregivers, to be there, to especially till a certain age. Imagine if a 2-year-old didn't trust you and believe you. Well, then they're not going to do what you say, which means then they could be eaten by the tiger, right? So we're wired to actually listen and follow and trust and set boundaries and have our own personalities and all of that, but we're wired to trust. And so when an adult is, especially a caregiver, is doing these behaviors to a child cannot psychologically make sense of that. So what the child has to do is they have to kind of figure out mechanisms to cope with what this thing that is definitely going wrong. And so those coping mechanisms, right, then grow into behaviors as adults. So an example of that would be emotional regulation. So people with complex PTSD, they have a hard time regulating their emotions. When they get mad, they get really mad, right? When they get sad, they get really sad. It's like their emotions are just magnified, and they can't seem to, even with all the techniques and the breathing and the yoga and whatever, they have a hard time regulating. Often people with complex PTSD have this tendency to dissociate, to just disconnect and like be floating somewhere else. We call that a change in consciousness. And again, that's a coping mechanism, because when the trauma happens again and again and again and again, it's a way that we kind of create this fantasy world, or we just leave so that we can stay psychologically safe. They often have a negative self-image. So they'll think that there's something wrong with them. Right? They don't necessarily see that it's the situation or it was the perpetrator, the abuser. It's like something was wrong with me. And if I just did things a little bit differently, then maybe I wouldn't fill in the blank. Right? And often that's linked to this distorted perception that they have of their abuser. Either like really, really, they think about them all the time, or they just actually don't even remember. I've had clients who, they tell me, oh, I had a great childhood, right? Oh, my parents were so loving and they're so kind. And then 3 or 4 sessions in, we start hearing about how, dad would take out his belt. Okay, so that's violence and abuse to a child. I don't call that loving and kind. I call that misguided discipline, maybe. But it's hugely traumatic for a child to be hit by their parent. It just is, because we weren't designed for that. We were designed to be protected by our parents. And even if it's for a good reason, for your own good, to teach you something, well, we're not designed for that. We're just simply not. And so when I talk to parents, we talk about discipline and teaching. You don't actually need to hit your kids to get them to do what you want. You just have to know your kids and be able to communicate with them and get through to them and not be in a power struggle with them, right? When your kids trust you, when they respect you, they'll want to do what you say. If you want more information about that, there's a great book called Hold On to Your Kids, Why Parents Need to Matter More Than Peers by Dr. Gordon Neufeld. And so, you might be from a culture like I am, where hitting was just kind of part of how we were raised. And so myself and all my friends, like we all went through that experience. We didn't think that there was really anything wrong with it. But then when you become an adult and there's all of these weird things that start happening, it's like, oh, what? Other people don't have this experience. So one of the things that can often happen too is that there's a loss of hope, right? There's this kind of jadedness that often happens with people with complex PTSD. They don't really believe in humanity. They don't really believe that people can be good. Or they take the other extreme where they just have these like Pollyanna views, like everybody's amazing and everybody's so good. And they do that again unconsciously to push away the pain of what happened during those experiences that created this complex PTSD. So I could probably talk about this for a lot longer, but those are my initial thoughts. I mean, this is not therapy. This is not like medical advice, but it's just a chance for you to hear a perspective about what are the differences between PTSD and complex PTSD. So in a nutshell, PTSD, a trauma that lasts and you can't move through. Complex PTSD, when there's an ongoing, reoccurring trauma that's happening, often from someone who's supposed to be protecting you. So that's the science, or that's as much as we know so far. I'm sure lots will be done about this topic in the years to come. Keep asking me your questions. If you have a further question about complex PTSD or trauma or childhood or any of the other topics that I've been talking about in this series, or something completely new, leave me a comment below. Let me know what you thought. Did you know about PTSD and complex PTSD? Have you heard some other things? Let me know what your thoughts are about what we're talking about here today in the comments below. Subscribe and like our YouTube channel, Dragonfly Wellness TV, and I'll see you next week.